Okay, so this webinar can be found on the NRC FAHE website. If you would like to be able to view this afterward, you're welcome to see it there. You can go ahead and hold all questions today until the end of the presentation, and there will be some time for discussion. I have turned on the closed captioning so you can see live transcription. If you choose to have that available, you can click at the top of your screen there. So today we're excited to have Chequita Brown here with us today. She is a research associate for the Office of Community College Research and Leadership at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and is a scholar practitioner with professional experience in the social work field and higher education. And her presentation today is To Tell or Not to Tell, Understanding the Self-Disclosure Attitudes and Experiences of Collegians with Foster Care Backgrounds. So thanks so much for being here today, Chequita, and I will go ahead and turn the floor over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. Are you able to see my screen okay? All right, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to turn my camera off. It'll just make it easier to focus on the presentation, if that's okay. All right, so good afternoon. My name is Chequita Brown, and thank you for attending this webinar. Today, I would like to share, just highlight some findings from a dissertation study that I completed recently. And as was mentioned, the title of this session is To Tell or Not to Tell, Understanding the Self-Disclosure Attitudes and Behaviors of Collegians with Foster Care Experience. Before we get started, I would like to just highlight a few details about myself, just to provide context to my experience in this area. My career trajectory progressed from from the social service field to post-secondary education, where I worked as an instructor, a practitioner, and now a researcher. As mentioned, I am a research assistant at the Office of Community College Research and Leadership. My research is more interdisciplinary, and it centers on adolescent and young adults transition from foster care to adulthood, also their post-secondary access and retention, student development, and even their career and life outcomes. But personally speaking, this work inspires me. The work that I do inspires me to continually try to create avenues for equitable supports, to increase educational attainment and even upward mobility for individuals with foster care backgrounds. So for this study, it began with just looking at how over the past few decades that the college enrollment rate among collegians with foster care experience, how it had gradually increased over time. But despite this increase in number, current and former youth in care are not recognized as a student population at most colleges and universities. And this is a noteworthy point because unlike their peers without foster care experience, these students often arrive on campus with a range of academic, social, financial, emotional barriers to their college success. And although post-secondary professionals are often considered the frontline support for college students, research suggests that faculty and staff are often unable to identify the student population on campus, and they are often unaware of and even unprepared to address some of their unique needs that may derive from their time in foster care. So when one considers the difficulty in trying to support a student population that is unidentifiable at an institution, it becomes clear that youth in care's invisibility at post-secondary institutions pose a unique challenge to their educational attainment. Having worked as a post-secondary practitioner, I understand the difficulty in adequately serving students I do not see or even recognize. And so unless these students self-disclose their foster identity, campus professionals are likely to struggle to not only identify students with foster care experience, but also provide the support, the unique support that's needed to help them. Sorry about that. So continuing with some of the background information, several scholars have noted that children and youth in care have expressed shame and embarrassment regarding certain labels that depict them in a negative light. Such labels, they typically carry this burden of a social disapproval that shape perceptions and even perpetuate stigmas about youth in care. Research also suggests that youth in care are often hesitant to self-disclose their foster identity and are more likely to conceal it to avoid being labeled or stigmatized. And since the foster youth label is not visibly recognizable, it could be considered a concealable stigma, if you would. It is easier for individuals to control whether or not to reveal their foster identity. And so looking at current and former youth in care who chooses to matriculate at a post-secondary institution, I became interested in understanding, how do these individuals decide whether they want to reveal that information because they don't have to? To date, little is known about those factors that actually influences their self-disclosure decisions and even their actions while on campus. For the present study, I sought to identify these salient reasons as to why and how college students would choose to reveal their foster identity, specifically to campus professionals and even their peers. There were two overarching research questions that guided the study. The first was, what are collegians with foster care backgrounds' perceptions of and experiences with self-disclosing their foster identity on campus? And the second question was, what factors influences collegians' decisions to self-disclose their foster identity to campus professionals and even their peers on campus? I utilized a qualitative research design with a phenomenological approach. Two methods were employed to collect data. First, I used online self-administered survey, which helped to determine participants' eligibility, and it was used to gather participants' background information. Also, individual one-on-one interviews were the primary data source, which were conducted via Zoom. Targeted participants were current undergraduate college students, ages 18 to 26 of any demographic category, who were either current or had previously been in the foster care system. To recruit these individuals, I distributed the recruitment flyer via social media platforms, and I worked with a representative at a statewide child welfare agency who distributed the recruitment flyer to current and former youth in care receiving post-secondary support through their agency. For data analysis, I began the process with having the interviews transcribed verbatim, which was important to preserve participants' authenticity in their thoughts and ideas. I used Braun and Clark's 6-step analytic process to identify and arrange codes according to emergent themes. And there were two extensive coding cycles. The initial one was designed to really generate as many codes as possible. And that was done by hand. Then the second cycle, the transcripts and codes were imported into Atlas, the data analysis software, in hopes to create a more systematic coding process across all the data sets and to reveal any inconsistencies in some of the originally assigned codes and to identify patterns in participants' responses to certain questions. To increase accuracy in the data, I incorporated peer debriefing and member checking. There were roughly 8 sessions, peer debriefing sessions. Some were scheduled and others were impromptu meetings, both individually and as a group, where I was able to get feedback on coding, themes, and even analysis throughout the process. And then member checking. This study, I really tried to center and incorporate the participants' voice as much as possible. And so it was very important for me to have them review their transcripts and also review and provide feedback and input on the synthesized findings that developed and emerged from the actual study. So just really quick to jump into the findings, I want to start with providing a demographic overview of what emerged from the data. There were a total of 16 participants, and though white participants were the largest racial category, over half of the sample derived from racially minoritized backgrounds. Also, the majority of the participants, they self-reported as female. Regarding foster care and housing status, 38% of the participants were current youth in care or had an open foster care case, which was important to note because these were college students who were currently enrolled at an institution, but still having to manage and navigate life with court cases and caseworkers and still manage and balance out their school responsibilities. The longest reported time in care was 10 and a half years, with the shortest being 2 years. And 31% of the participants indicated that they had been adopted through the foster care system. With regard to housing, the majority of the participants lived in an apartment on or near campus. However, 31% reported living on campus in a residence hall during the academic year, which is also noteworthy because these individuals had several of them had open cases. And so with them still navigating the foster care system while in school and then having to figure out housing during school breaks. One participant also reported that he was struggling with housing security and he was couch surfing at the time of the interview. So real quick, just want to look at the education and student status of the sample. Majority of the participants were full-time students with 87.5% of the sample being full-time. 75% of the participants were enrolled at four-year institutions. However, 44% of the sample had either attended or graduated from community college at some point during their college experience. That include transferring from 2-year to 4-year, as well as reverse transfers students. And 75% of the sample was from the Midwest region, or they attended an institution in the Midwest region, which another 18% was on the West Coast. They attended school in the Western region. So for the findings, 6 major themes emerged through thematic analysis. Here is a list of those themes arranged according to the research question. For the sake of time, I will highlight select themes from each research question. I also included direct quotes from a few of the participants, really to center their voices and views related to select themes. I will not read each quote, but I do encourage you to read along to hear what the participants had to say about certain topics. So regarding question 1 and their views about self-disclosure, participants candidly shared how negative perceptions about youth in care invoked, feelings of embarrassment, shame, feeling less than, and even stigmatized. Participants suggested the general public's lack of knowledge about foster care and even the media's portrayal of youth in care perpetuated ignorance and inaccuracies about the foster care experience. And so participants' perception about their foster identity, coupled with existing social stigmas about being a youth in care, profoundly influenced their self-disclosure attitudes and actions on campus. Participants also shared their views about the foster youth label itself, with some describing the label as being emotionally triggered whenever they are referred to as a foster youth. Thus, they suggested the need to change the label altogether. So Anthony, one of the participants, he shared this. He said, just take away the name foster youth in general. Just like they're not foster youth, they're human beings. We're human beings. You know, foster youth doesn't mean we're any different than the person who does live with their parents. I don't know. I feel like that is a huge trigger. Participants focused on this need to center their humanness. This was a common idea that was shared among all the participants. They emphatically expressed preference towards amplifying their strengths and even their accomplishments as a way to redirect the tension from the title foster youth and even the struggles associated with having been in the foster care system. To further challenge some of those perceptions and even to change the narrative associated with having been in the foster care system, some participants suggested that self-disclosing provided an opportunity to increase awareness about youth in care, their strengths, as well as the challenges. It presented a way to push back against certain stereotypical perceptions and labels that have limited their potential as individuals to really amplify their human side. As one participant stated, disclosing allowed her to turn the conversation to her strengths that she had developed because of her foster care experience instead of just only referring to her trauma. Another participant indicated that self-disclosing to peers on campus offered this cathartic release, specifically when they were sharing within a safe space or a safe zone. But however, there were three participants in particular that described the benefit of having to have repetitiously self-disclosed throughout their time in care. These were individuals who were in care for an extended period of time. And so they felt like the repetition of having to say I'm in care over time helped them to become desensitized or emotionally detached to any shame and embarrassment associated with having to say I'm in foster care. For instance, Aaliyah said, I don't really care that much. Like, it's not really a big deal to me. Basically, I've been in foster care since I was 8 years old. It's not a secret. And who cares that they know? When she was talking about they, she was saying people on campus. When we look at perceived risk associated with having to self-disclose to peers and professionals on campus, participants shared that at least 81% of the participants described experiencing a myriad of emotional reactions when and after having to reveal their foster identity on campus. Participants shared their discomfort with being treated as less than or differently because of their foster identity. One participant, Fiona, shared that when after disclosing to a friend, she was made to feel embarrassed or even pitied. She described the experience saying, "I told him that I grew up in foster care. He assumed that that was everything about my identity, instead of what I've been through. I almost felt like this person thought that I was damaged after I told him I was in foster care because he was treating me differently before I said that." Participants shared their desire to be seen as a regular student. That was something that was emphasized repetitively throughout in different interviews. They expressed fear of being pitied and viewed differently based on their identity. And they also talked about this idea of indicating that it will be, for some, better to conceal their foster identity than to reveal only certain aspects of their experience to avoid being mistreated, made fun of, or to experience this emotional harm on campus. So understanding some of those risks and potential rewards or benefits, it was able to lead right into allowing students to talk about their attitudes about self-disclosure overall. And so 62% described being open to selectively disclosing on campus only under certain conditions. As one participant, Aaliyah, said, she said, I'll say I'm a foster youth, but I'm not going to spill all of my guts to you. And so, despite some participants' willingness to reveal certain details related to their foster identity, each participant expressed a desire to maintain autonomy in self disclosing. This was a central idea that was shared among all the participants. They posited the need to maintain decision making authority over whether or not to divulge that personal information about their foster care background to others on campus. So, look at Parker's statement, who was a student on campus. She said, I like to disclose. I don't like when other people say it. I don't like, I don't even like when my mom mentions it to people. It's not embarrassing for me. It's not something I feel like I should hide from the world, but it's something that I want to be able to tell to people. And if someone's going to know it, it's going to come from me. This idea of I don't mind sharing was prevalent in amongst most of the participants. However, it needed to come from them. And here Parker expressed a concern that kind of introduced that third party disclosure that other participants also noted their disdain for this third party disclosure, indicating that it needed to come from them unless otherwise indicated. And this applied to not only their parents, but even peers and even professionals on campus. But still, there were about 37% of participants who preferred to conceal their identity altogether. They weren't even open to revealing this information. For instance, Jessica shared that this life as a college student provided her, it's a fresh start. It's easier to forget about what's done and over with than to have to relive it with other people, specifically people on campus that didn't know anything about her story. For students like Jessica, concealing her foster identity made it easier to just be a college student without drawing unwanted attention to their past experience having been in the foster care system. But for those who chose to actually share their foster identity on campus, many of the participants spoke about verbal communication as the commonly used approach to sharing this information. Others talked about how they revealed it through written forms of communication, which was always directed to a campus professional or authority figure, such as a teacher, or for reasons like to write an essay or class reflection, or even for a scholarship application. And so Zaria talked about, she shared this, she said, TRIO, they had a scholarship that they were giving out, and there was a question that asked, do you have any hardships? And so whenever I was filling out applications where it specifically asked, I would address it. So regarding research question 2, we talked a little bit about just their interactions with professionals, but the findings specifically related to research question 2, in looking at those factors that will determine if the students will share, there was a stark distinction between how students self-disclose to campus professionals versus peers. According to participants, self-disclosure to campus professionals was more intentional in nature. In fact, 69% of the sample indicated they were more inclined to disclose to campus professionals versus their peers because they felt like they were more accustomed to sharing personal details with non-parental adult figures, such as caseworkers, foster parents, therapists. They had grown accustomed to that with their time and care. And then also, they were more likely to talk to campus professionals because they perceived these individuals as being more mature and could handle appropriately their sensitive information about their past and their experiences in the child welfare system. But self-disclosing to professionals on campus was described also in more of a transactional nature because the participants described staff and faculty as being someone who could provide essential resources in exchange for their personal information. So again, having to reveal these details about their past was considered emotionally triggering. And so participants suggested that in order for them to consider disclosing, there needed to be some type of benefit or purpose otherwise they're just kind of putting themselves in this emotional harm for no reason. So for instance, Pink Rose, she was one of the 6 participants who said and does conceal her foster identity on campus. She said the only time admittedly that I will do that means self-disclose is that if I see some sort of immediate benefit to myself in terms of like faculty or like people that are basically not my peers. It depends on what I can get out of saying it. So if there's not really an anticipated benefit, then I'm just sharing it and emotionally draining myself for no benefit. This is important to consider as we think through ways to support current and former youth in care on campus, while also figuring out how to respect their self-disclosure views and address their hesitancies to reveal this information. In contrast, self-disclosure among peers was determined based on certain relational cues. So with professionals, it was more about the transactional, what I can get, but with peers, it was centering on these relational cues, like the peer's temperament or the degree of trust within a relationship. 62% of the participants believed trust or the lack thereof was a major factor that influenced whether they would self-disclose to peers. And participants believe their peers' willingness to divulge personal information also helped to minimize their own fear of exposing vulnerable information about their foster identity. And so here, Lancelot, they shared how their peers' willingness to reveal aspects of his identity encouraged them to share aspects of their identity. They said, I really felt like I could share it because of my friend and how he said, oh, I'm Jewish. And just like how he was comfortable about it, and it was not a big deal. It's his identity. So one day when it was like relevant and important for me to say, like, oh yeah, I'm a foster kid, I did. Participants expressed high comfort levels with self-disclosing their foster identity and experiences whenever there was a mutual exchange of vulnerable information among their peers. Another factor that influenced self-disclosure among peers was this possibility of making connections or building community with individuals who shared similar identities. So finding this safe space among peers with similar stigmatizing identities increased the likelihood that participants would self-disclose their foster identity. For example, Justin described being comfortable with revealing details about his experience in foster care among his peers at an LGBT IQA network. He said, I was just talking about, coming out as trans and then, being adopted and having to deal with that. It was really cool, bonding moment where it's like, you were free to share if you wanted to. And other participants spoke about the challenges with having to manage these multiple identities on campus, specifically when you think about revealing one aspect of your identity and how it can unintentionally expose other social identities that maybe they weren't ready to reveal. So, for instance, Pink Rose insisted her peers believed she was she comes from a middle class background, though she is a foster youth. And this helps her, in her opinion, helps her to fit in with certain students on her campus. And so by assuming this more privileged student status, Pink Rose she believes she's privy to conversations that she would not normally hear if people had known she was truly a foster youth or low-income first-generation student. And so she said, oftentimes I hear people's true feelings, even though like they don't actually know that, I'm a part of that population, whether it's like low-income or, a youth in foster care, or even a first-generation student. So knowing how her peers feel about other disadvantaged populations reinforces Pink Rose's decision to conceal her own foster identity. And Pink Rose insists that discovery of her foster identity would potentially expose her other social identities, which is not positively accepted among the students at her school. So here, I just want to go over the findings really quick. As I prepare to wrap up, it's important to quickly highlight a few points. Overall, participants who had a more favorable attitude about self-disclosing and about their foster identity and experience were more likely to self-disclose to professionals and peers under certain circumstances. However, just to reiterate, 69% favored um, self-disclosing to professionals more than their peers because of their belief that staff would be able to manage their information, use discretion, and they wouldn't necessarily use it for harm, but to use it to help them as opposed to their peers. Also, participants believed it was necessary to weigh the risk of self-disclosing against potential rewards to determine whether sharing their foster identity would either help them or cause further emotional harm. And that was to both professionals or to peers. But whether self-disclosing to campus professionals or peers, each participant were adamantly expressed the need to maintain decision-making power over how that information was shared on campus and how it was disseminated to others, whether that's professionally or among their friends and peers. So I want to highlight a few recommendations that emerged from this study. And the central theme is when supporting youth in care on campus, partnerships. That was a central theme that emerged. It is really necessary for post-secondary institutions, specifically those who do not identify students on campus with foster care experience, to really think through how can we recognize them, track them at the institution, and to build in the supports that's needed in a way that does not create harm or further stigmatize this population. Partnerships with external units such as the child welfare agencies is essential for also gathering information about youth in care at the institution who are receiving financial support to go to school. There's opportunities for even cross-campus collaborations, specifically with those units like admissions or financial aid and even housing, academic advising, where you can help identify and even provide those holistic supports for these students who are on campus, thinking about the students who had open cases and were living on campus, where campus was considered home, but had not disclosed their status as a current foster youth, but knowing that the holiday season was approaching, where schools would be closing and could potentially have some housing and security issues. Regarding professional practices, clearly there was a need for just awareness and really understanding of college students with foster care experiences, even when the population is not recognized at the institution. Their invisibility is not a reason to not be aware of them, but there could be an opportunity to increase knowledge through training, and even looking for ways to support them, really evaluating what it means to have youth in care self-disclose their foster identity on campus, and what does it cost them. Many times I know there are a lot of institutions that currently offer support for for youth in care, and there are institutions who are considering offering support, but really thinking through what would it take for these students to actually reveal that aspect of their lives, and how do they feel about making the decision to self-disclose. And regarding programming, kind of touching on that, elaborating a little bit, is really engaging these students at the institution without exposing their foster identity, looking for ways to center their strengths and recognize their what they bring to their transferable skills that they've gained, their resilience, and all those other aspects of their identity besides centering their foster identity. That might even play into how programming is marketed, and even how student programs are, the names that's associated with those programs. And then really understanding the effects of identity-based behavior and its impact on students' privacy and vulnerability to stigmatization. Once students some students may choose not to engage in certain campus programs for foster youth just because they know once others see that they are a part of this group, it could out them or expose their identity. So it may be beneficial to explore if and how participation in certain campus programs for youth in care does it increase their vulnerability, even though from a professional lens, we're thinking it's going to strengthen their retention, but looking at how it's impacting them emotionally. And then finally, just centering the strength-based approach as we frame our support. Students in this study really did want to focus and amplify their strengths that they bring to the table, and not focus on the trauma that they've experienced. And so, even in our approach and our services, making sure that we are centering their strengths, and if there's a way to support them. A few students even said, I wish I can get the support without having to self-disclose. So that tells you a lot about maybe their hesitancies and to reveal that information, or their idea about not wanting to identify with that label once they're on campus to become, what they call normal college students. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you for your presence and your attention. At this time, I would like to open up the floor for questions, discussions, and comments. And so I'm going to stop sharing and I'll turn my camera back on.
Thanks so much. So we do have a comment from Angelique in the chat. She said, Chequita, I felt very supported when I disclosed this information at the school I attended, but felt stigmatized by my employer after I transitioned from college to the workforce. I'm not sure if you have that interest in your future research, if this would be an interest for you in taking your research next. And thanks for sharing that chapter as well, Angelique.
Thank you.
And so as you were speaking, you have quite a few young people in your study who did feel safe and felt like there was a benefit to disclosing. And I'm just wondering this may or may not be a question you had asked, or for the programs you were connected with in terms of how you recruited your students, if any of those schools are preparing students to say, this was a safe place for you to disclose, but when you transition out of college to the workforce, you may not have that, same protection in that new environment. And to what extent does that type of conversation happen with students as they're preparing to transition from higher ed to the workforce?
A lot of them, several of the students in the study, they were, very early on in their college experience. What I did find is that those who were maybe in their senior year and had, been in school for a while, and by senior year, I mean just they are a senior, but they have been in school for maybe 6 or 7 years because it was just a long journey. Just life had taught them that it's okay to share. This is a part of my story, and I'm okay with revealing this information, and I don't really care who knows. It was those who were early on in their college experience, freshman, sophomore, that were still trying to navigate this new freedom, this new way of expressing and revealing their identity within this space, that maybe they hadn't even really thought about revealing it within a professional context post-college, right? But yeah, that's a very interesting way of looking at how they reveal that, and really finding a sense of security in knowing that this is okay, this is a part of my story, but at the same time feeling supported and feeling like there was a sense of safety in revealing that in certain spaces. Because there were one student in particular, she disclosed to her academic advisor, and she said she felt so deflated and unsupported, and she never went back to her advisor again, because they didn't understand. She was going back and forth to court cases and really trying to navigate that for herself and for her siblings. And she left feeling very small, and she never went back to that person again. So, it just depends on how secure they feel and how safe they feel in revealing that information.
So Angela brought up as well, just this whole idea of there being differences across the lifespan, which I don't know if that any of your research touched on any of that, but that would be some kind of interesting points to look at, across the lifespan. When do people choose to self-disclose, and how does that change throughout time?
Yeah, I didn't look intentionally at the different lifespans, but it came up in the conversations. And part of it was, like I said, for some of the participants, they grew desensitized to having to say it, just repeatedly having to say, I'm a foster youth. Over time, it was just like, you know what, this is my life. But then there were others, no matter what stage of life. One of the participants, she was a mother of two, and she had just recently graduated. She just recently graduated with her bachelor's degree. So yay to her. But she was adamant. She never told her friends. She never told anyone that she was a youth in care. And so looking at someone who went from, throughout her life in the child welfare system, aged out at 21. Now you are a mother with two children, a 3-year-old and like a 1-month-old. And you still refuse to let people know. So it's really interesting. She's just like, it's embarrassing, and she doesn't want any part of that that identity associated with who she is, because right now she's very successful. She graduated, she's a school teacher, and she's trying to be better than her parents and raise her children differently. So it would be definitely beneficial to look at what that looks like and how that changes and progresses with different people's life experiences. But it was very different across the board for different participants in the study. Any others? You can unmute yourself and speak. I'm trying to read the comments as well too, but please unmute yourself and share if you would like.
Carrie mentioned also, consideration that maybe the students who are willing to participate in research are more comfortable with disclosing, or are at like various places in processing their stories, their journeys.
Yeah, you mentioned a great point, Carrie. What I found is that they were more willing to talk to me because, and this came up in our conversation, was I didn't require them to meet me in person. And once we started the interview, they had the option to turn their cameras off. So there was still this, I'm asking you to disclose, but still making sure I'm not making sure I'm not fostering greater uncomfortable, making you uncomfortable or causing you to have disease in the midst of this conversation, right? And so, they were willing to share, but even in that, there was some hesitancy, or they preferred to have their cameras off, or that increased their comfort level. So it was still a fine balance in having the conversation with them, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense, Chequita, and it's actually something I'm going to have to ponder farther in terms of research, because the camera on, camera off option that's a really profound thought, Chequita. That's good.
Yeah, it really did work too. And I found that when I gave them the option to turn their camera off, they were more likely to talk. I even had one participant say, can we just, we can start on Zoom, but can I call in? Right. So it was just something about me not staring at them, that if we met in person, they didn't have autonomy over how to show up, or, if they wanted to express sadness, or, it just alleviated the pressure, right, of being able to have this intimate conversation if they really didn't want to disclose, but I feel better talking about it with the camera off.
Yeah, I mean, it makes 100% sense. Mm-hmm. It's just such a good thought. So, I mean, kudos to you.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Any other thoughts or suggestions?
I put my comment in the chat, but I can mention it. I really appreciate your presentation, and there's so many layers to this question. I work on a college campus. I've been doing this work for many years, and it's always a constant consideration. But my question was, did disclosure in a classroom setting come up at all in your research? So I'm thinking I've had a number of examples over the years of students who are in a course that is discussing maybe the foster care system or another system with which they have lived experience. And then disclosure really comes up as sort of almost a academic, educational, question.
Yes, it did come up. And I'm thinking of two students in particular who talked about going back to how they reveal it, right? And so that method of verbal versus verbal one-on-one versus written in an exam, written in a reflection, or written for application, right? Scholarship application. And so one student in particular, she was in a social work class and the conversation came up. And because of how peers were talking about the social service, the system, she said, no, I will not reveal this part of my life openly, but she wrote about it in her paper, which was directed towards those authority figures. So again, it went back to their comfort level of, I'll say this in, a paper, or I'll say this as a reflection, but this isn't open for debate. We're not going to open this up in this space where I will further increase my vulnerability. And even if other people were sharing, they were hesitant to do it openly. And then other opportunities in classrooms were, when conversations would happen around, family dynamics, it's like, I'm not going to reveal that as well. So they were very selective about what they would share without putting themselves in emotional harm. Does that make sense with your experiences, Colleen?
Yes, I think it's been interesting because I've definitely had students, I think, particularly in social work, have sort of opinions and experiences that are in contrast or contradictory potentially to what is being presented by their faculty. And so I think it can be complicated because they're hearing from sort of a theoretical perspective from a faculty member, but they have lived experience that maybe is different or could provide a more complete story about the system. And they struggle with whether or not to share that in that setting. Sometimes they do, and I think it's been a rewarding experience, and other times they choose not to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I think the other thing that stood out a lot within this study is just the nuanced ways they negotiate those multiple identities, and which to share in which setting, and whether, because several of them talked about how they were more stigmatized by, say, their foster identity than maybe their sexual orientation, or the fact that they had a learning disability, or they had mental health issues that would be things that would be stigmatizing based off of the audience that you are in. But when they compared the two, they were more stigmatized by their foster identity. And so I'll talk more about my mental health, but I won't reveal my foster identity in certain spaces. And so that was really interested in how they determine what to share, when to share, and how revealing one aspect could potentially reveal another. And they were very intentional about how they will reveal this information. It was really interesting. Any other thoughts? I'm trying to read off go ahead.
Hey, Beth, can you ask your question? I don't know if everybody knows the acronyms you're using.
Sure. And I was trying to use the acronyms that Chequita had used, and I'm not sure if I captured it accurately. Okay. And so, yeah, thank you so much for this research. It's so important. It's so insightful. We have been doing a study with undergraduate students, some of whom have histories of involvement in the foster care system, but are sort of part of the larger group of independent students. And it seems like there's a real struggle at the level of the institution in terms of how to recognize and identify and support these students in ways that are not stigmatizing, exactly because of this dilemma that you've illustrated. And so I was curious if any of the students that you talked to had ideas about ways that universities could do this better.
One student, and I'm thinking of, she was a school, I'm trying to see, yes, she spoke about how she would not mind participating, engaging in sports if it was discreet. If
Okay.
it was, it didn't have like foster, success, not, I don't even know if that's a real name, but if it didn't have that identifier in the language, right? But it's just a group. And if they were discreet about how they support the students or invited them to participate, because again, it's that identity-based behavior, right? Once I say I'm a part of this group, then people on campus, if I'm not really ready to reveal that, now my peers are aware. And I'm not ready for them to know that part of my life yet, right? And so they talked about it, they gave examples about doing it in a discreet way, and looking at it from how they can amplify again the strengths of the program, and opening it up, where it might be people who have foster care experience, but it might be adoption, but they can bring a friend or something where you can kind of blend in, because the goal is to be a normal student. And they kept saying, I just want to be a normal student, or I just want to be a student or a college student. And so those were a few of the ideas that they talked about, that, hey, yes. And this was, I remember, I think it was Carrie or Colleen who said most of them felt they were on a safe institution. So even though they felt safe at the institution, they still didn't feel like they would want to share that information. They said, well, one student said, I feel like my institution is inclusive, but I still don't want to share that. Right. And so it's the institution, then it's the student body, right? And bringing it down to that level. So yeah, that was the one thing that was mentioned about trying to create it in such a way where there's some discretion around it, but still build out their strengths versus, amplifying. This is for foster youth or students with foster care experience. And yeah, that was what they talked about.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Because you're still centering the foster youth, right? Even though it's designed to strengthen and give, exposure to campus opportunities and study abroad, but the title itself centers foster.
It's such a paradox, right? Of like how to recognize that this is a group of students with unique needs without reinforcing the stigma.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. Any other thoughts? I know we're wrapping up shortly, but this is great conversation and feedback.
So Chequita, one question is, what made you have a particular interest to want to focus your dissertation on this topic? And then where are you planning on going next from here based on what you've learned?
So what got me interested in this topic was my own experience when I was working as a academic advisor. And that student, I was working with a student who was struggling academically. And they started off very strong, started off the semester strong. And right around mid-semester, midterm, we started noticing a decline in their academic performance. Long story short, you received the early, what is called early report. I can't remember what it's called. Yes, the notice to say, hey, the student is not doing well. And so pulling on my social work skills, I knew how to approach the student in a way that didn't say, why are your grades failing? It was more so how are you doing? How is life going on? How are you adjusting to campus? And really, when I took that approach, I found out that the student was working extra hours and they had increased their workload. They were trying to earn more money. And so then I said, oh, well, did your school fees change or anything? They were trying to find money to secure housing for the upcoming break. Had no idea that there were youth in care or youth on campus who didn't have a home to go through during the break. And so that triggered a conversation to say, okay, are there more students like this on campus? And then that triggered the interest in, okay, well, why didn't you say anything? And what was, you know, not to ask the student that, but what hindered you from identifying and saying that? Because we have international students. Clearly, we probably could have worked something out, maybe, I'm thinking, you know, for this care or this housing during breaks. And so that triggered the thought, and wanting to understand what are these factors that influences, what these salient reasons that would trigger a student to reveal this information. And I remember sharing this with someone. They said, well, students need help, they can ask. I was like, but I'm not really sure if that's the case when, one, our students are so resilient and they're used to having to do things on their own. And they're leaning into, I got to figure this out on my own.
Mhm.
So how do you get them to share that when life has taught them, I need to figure this out on my own?
Mhm.
And so that's where that idea came from. And then plus I work with First Star Academy. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. There's a site at Illinois State where it's a pre-college program for youth in care, and understanding that they are trying to transition to college. And I was like, well, if you're already socialized to talking about your foster identity as a high school student with us, will you continue that once you go to campus if there isn't a campus-based program for you at the institution? And so really wanting to understand that and maybe create resources or ways to say, hey, this is how we can support this population on our campuses. And then where I'm going from here, I am continuing to do research. I'm serving on a research team right now. I'm looking at community college students and their socialization and their sense of belonging on campus. So I'm continuing to do research around this topic, as well as I'm on the market. So I'm looking for a job since I completed my dissertation.
Awesome. Are you looking education, social work, or something else?
Child welfare, mostly, leaning towards there and creating a bridge back to education if possible.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes. And yes, we can talk Bell, C Bell. Yes. My information, I'll put it back on this. I'll drop it in the chat. I would love to hear from you. Any other questions or comments, thoughts before we wrap up? I know I don't want to get us in trouble.
Well, thanks so much for your talk today, Chequita. It was really great. Just a quick plug for our next webinar will be on Tuesday, February 28th from 11 to noon Pacific time. And we'll be hearing from Dr. Melanie Duché, adjunct professor, McGill University School of Social Work and senior researcher and project manager, and Child Welfare League of Canada, based in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And her presentation is titled Equitable Standards for Transition to Adulthood for Youth in Care, a Canadian First Voice Advocate led initiative. So join us for that one as well. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. And I'm so excited for our next talk. I think this is the first time we've had a presentation with an international perspective. So hopefully you'll be excited and come back and hear that.
Well, thanks so much. Let me